It started with this image, which appeared in Dream 2 years ago. In the dream, I have an identical twin. We both have this identical tattoo on our left shoulders. At the time, the image strikes me as completely mysterious, with few amplifications with which to open it up. Nevertheless, I do notice that the line down the center, while part of the illustration, is actually in Dream not seen but felt as a downward motion, hence the arrow at the bottom. Faithful attention to the imaginal world, says James Hillman, is nothing more than re-mythologizing. Myths illustrate the intra-psychic processes at work now, presently. These processes are often more complex than we are accustomed to holding, and out of conscious reach, which is where the symbolic bridge comes, which is helpful. And here it is from my sketchbook from a few years ago, bridging the gap between the shores of consciousness and the great unconscious. This presentation, titled Cross Directions, Pursuing Imagination Towards Symbol Formation, Individuation, and Art, documents a remythologizing in progress, one discovered through my own faithful attention to imagination and trust in the creative urge. I am in the midst of a mythos in bloom, one that feels both personal and part of the collective process Carl Jung refers to when he says, whoever knows God has an effect on him, or her, it. Greek philosopher Heraclitus said that nature likes to hide, well, fortunately, it also likes to play. The artistic process is one way of playing with nature, dancing with God and swimming in the deep waters of the unconscious. Help along the way is provided by attention and respect for synchronicity, curiosity, and courage. And I thank you for joining me. Some background about myself. I was born in Washington, D.C., but came of age in the suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia. My family was fairly passive toward religion, and I'm fortunate not to have much baggage around that, either way. As a teenager, my interest in religious symbolism was informed more by mythical spiritual curiosity than by religious experience or education. It was cultural curiosity that eventually led me, as a young adult, to collect religious records like this one, which I did mostly for the rich cover imagery. Each one is almost a mini remythologizing itself. Some of the imagery bears resemblance to the mythical imagery of heavy metal records of my high school years. There's mystery and often a rudimentary aesthetic that continues to inspire me. I grabbed some of that inspiration last summer in order to satisfy a creative yearning, embarking on a quest to design my own album cover. As you can see in these prototypes, a theme quickly emerges. I'll come back to these shortly. Concurrently, the next stage of symbol formation appears in the form of a curious image found on the door of an abandoned manufacturing building south of Atlanta. This is when the remythologizing process really begins to take off. My attention focuses on the central figure, a sole practitioner busy at his craft, looking like a musician or even an alchemist. My gaze lands fatefully on what strikes me as an upside-down Latin cross, right in the center. My intellect tells me that it's merely coincidental, and yet my imagination persists. Where is this leading me, I wonder? Stick with the image, says James Hillman, imploring me to trust the process. My attention returns to the dream tattoo image and the directional line in the center. I imagine this as instructional, like directions on a map, and apply it to my curiosity about the decal. Here, my gaze is coaxed further down the central axis past the horizontal barrier of the printer's desk. Followed all the way down, there comes an unexpected shift. The inverted cross, pursued below the horizon, transforms into its upturned twin. Jung speaks to the symbolism of the upturned Latin-style cross, specifically to the central axis, which he describes as an elongation of the center of gravity. The divine center of spiritual man, he says, is removed from the earth. It is somewhere up in the sky. Further, one could say that the divine symbol descends to the point where it meets man, he says, and then pulls him up in a sort of inflation. Notice that Jung refers here to a descent that reaches only to the surface of the earth, where humans dwell. The remythologizing process at hand, however, takes us below the surface toward the ground of being. I'm struck by the poetic symbolism of pursuing an inverted cross only to discover its mirror opposite, as if one cross's direction must be explored in order for the gifts of its opposite to be genuinely and substantially received. A mysterious tension is stirring, and from this place I envision a simple picture of these opposites conjoined. One cross reaching for the sky and the other plunging into the earth. Caught in this tension between heaven and hell is the earth's surface. I elect to represent the earth's surface with its own horizontal beam. At which moment the two-dimensional representation of my symbol in progress is born. I notice that this triple cross contains not just 3 horizontal bars crossing a central vertical axis, but also 3 basic 4-armed crosses, 2 smaller, 1 larger. One of my guiding principles for this imaginal process is the application of axioms. First up is the axiom, as above, so below. Applied to this triple cross, it serves to accentuate the tension in the center. The tension of existing simultaneously above and below, of being neither fully of earth or sky, caught in the middle. The central horizontal axis, I imagine, is this place. Perhaps a reworking of the axiom is in order, accounting for the underworld, as above, so below, so beneath. Notice how the 2 crosses have produced a third, and also the 2 points of the original axiom above and below now also have a third. The process continues as I envision full representation of the 4 directions of the Earth's surface, turning a 2-dimensional picture into a 3-dimensional object, here constructed of wood. What contained 3 crosses now includes a 4th. And the next axiom comes into play. It's called the axiom of Maria, named for the 2nd century alchemist who invented it. The axiom states, from the 1 comes the 2nd. From the 2nd comes the 3rd, and from the 3rd is the 4th, that is the 1. It wonderfully maps the symbol formation process so far, which starts with the 1 inverted cross, giving way to its opposite twin, and then a 3rd, And here, the third expands into a fourth. For this reason, I've called this particular cross the Maria cross, after the axiom it mirrors. The axiom of Maria speaks to the circular nature of intra-psychic processes, wherein a conclusion will often bring one back around to reveal a new beginning. The last part of the axiom that leads us back to the one foreshadows the final stage of this symbolic process. First, I'd like to pursue support for the Maria cross through amplification, here found within illustrations of an ancient alchemical text, which probably all of you are familiar with by now, called the Rosarium. The alchemists, says Jungian scholar Edward Edinger, were rooted in the Western psyche, which we've inherited. So their imagery, their fantasy, their dream is our fantasy and our dream. The pictures within the Rosarium reflect intra-psychic transformations taking place on the alchemical journey toward wholeness. And this is the first one. This is the vessel. The first one depicts a vessel surrounded by smoke. Cosmic opposites are represented by the sun and the moon, and in between them is a six-pointed star. There's the star right in the middle. The Maria cross itself, with 6 primary points, resembles this star. In the second picture, a dove is coming down from the star carrying a flower, inserting it in between 2 human figures who are also holding their own flowers. The dove is facilitating a unification between the opposites, and look at the symbol being created by this unity. 2 horizontal stems with a vertical stem, much like the Maria cross. In the next picture, the likeness of the central object to the Maria cross becomes even stronger. In my fantasy, the dove is an emissary bridging the unconscious with conscious reality in a very profound way. 3 sets of opposites, sun and moon, man and woman, above and below, are unified by this 6-pronged object, suggesting something important within the collective psyche of that time, and perhaps this time, seeking awareness. The connecting principle, I believe, between the process of the alchemists who created the Rosarium and my present-day remythologizing is the dedication of imagination to what James Hillman calls faith in images. And he says, psychological faith is reflected in an ego that gives credit to images. Its trust is in the imagination as the only incontrovertible reality, directly presented, immediately felt. But we have further to go. The image is still unfolding. While beholding the Maria cross, I find myself wondering what could be hidden in the very center. I return to the axiom of Maria for guidance, wondering what has not yet been revealed. From the third comes the fourth, which is also the one, it says, and I'm looking at the center of the Maria cross, which is concealed by merging horizontal arms. And notice what looks like the outline of a cube. To get to it, though, we have to reverse the process, deconstructing the cross to reveal the center again. And there it is. Pursuing further the spirit of the axiom of Maria and Heraclitus's idea of hidden nature, I wonder what might be inside of the cube. my concurrent album art project draws my attention. In my fantasy, this piece depicts a mysterious orb emerging from deep within the womb of the cross, which is itself falling away, its purpose fulfilled. And at this moment, I decide that hidden in the center of the Maria cross, the alchemical unifying object is an orb surrounded by a cube. Inquiry into what this cubed orb could symbolize is aided by amplification of a vital alchemical symbol, the squared circle. And about this, there's always a Jung quote, isn't there? About this, Jung says, squaring the circle breaks down the original chaotic unity into the four elements and then combines them again into a higher unity. The product is generally called the quintessence, and this by no means is the only name for the ever hoped for and never to be discovered one. It has, as the alchemists say, 1,000 names. One of those names, I believe, is the pleroma, and this is its fundamental representation. This is where my symbolic journey has been leading. It is nothing less than the tension point between all irreconcilable opposites. It is the final paradox. Its appearance here and now hints of the terrible, wonderful path of collective individuation. It hides within, is of, and transcends the cross. It has been there all along. This is from the 10th century. See the orb right in the middle. In the pleroma, says Jung, time is a relative concept and needs to be complemented by that of the simultaneous existence of all historical processes. Mythic themes, repeated throughout space and time, he says, exist in the pleroma as an eternal process. Ultimately, Jung says, in 7 Sermons to the Dead, the pleroma is nothing and everything, wherein both thinking and being cease, since the eternal and the infinite possess no qualities. For the final stage of the remythologizing process, it comes back down to earth, as I encounter the shadow. What story would be complete without the shadow? I bump into it while in full research mode, proudly hunting for amplifications of the Maria Cross. There are several, historic and modern, which approximate the two-dimensional version of the Maria Cross, but don't quite match. Some of those are from bands. The closest visual match that I could find, as fate would have it, comes from the journal of a 17-year-old young man. The artist is Dylan Klebold, who on April 20th, 1999, co-partnered a killing spree at his high school in Columbine, Colorado. The shadow arrives, and I'm forced to begrudgingly accept that this infamous young man has tapped synchronistically into something very similar to my own mythos. He too grappled with the opposites, but with tragically different results. Why have I been led here, I wonder? My resistance to aligning with this infamous figure is palpable. But let's look at more of Dylan's journal drawings. A journal that he entitled on the first page, Existences. Like the early stirrings of my symbol formation process, the second page of his journal shows 2 opposing crosses as one. There it is. Mirroring each other, about which he writes, the battle between good and bad never ends. Focus is drawn curiously to the center, where he places himself, says me, with instruction to cut here. Note the synchronicity. The center is indicated with a square. Above and to the right, the square expands three-dimensionally into a cube. Eerily, I cannot avoid the implication. This troubled young man imagined the very cube concealed in the center of the cross that I would envision decades later. A few pages further, and his own triple cross appears, which he names the everlasting contrast, a surprisingly sophisticated moniker which sounds descriptive of a pleroma. This plainly shows a young man trying to navigate depression, alienation, and a churning libido via creative examination of his own psyche. He was, however, ill-equipped for the deep work, writing in his journal, "The ups and downs of fate are forever, good and bad, equal, me. Existence is like infinity times itself. The zombies have set their place in my mind." He prematurely reaches the paradoxical pleroma, infinity times itself, with dire consequences. Reflecting on who I was at Dylan's tender age, this is the shadow, it's throwing me off. It strikes me how similar we may have been. This drawing is mine. This is something I drew when I was in high school, at just about the same age. Black Sabbath was a musical group dramatically embodying the opposites, playing songs of darkness, yet adorned with Latin crosses around their necks. To my teenage self, they were the brave explorers of the underworld. This image I created reflects a young mind fascinated with myth, symbolism, and the opposites of darkness and light. Note the angle of the cross in this drawing and how it reappears 3 decades later as part of a clue leading me toward awareness of the orb gestating in the cross's center. This mythos that I share with you today marks the completion of a cycle, of a process which apparently started in high school. Over 30 years ago. From the one comes the second. From the second comes the third. And from the third comes the fourth, that is the one. That's the axiom of Maria, as vital today as it was centuries ago. With the completion of one cycle, we arrive at a new beginning. Of Jung's Aeon, Edward Edinger states, "The numinous secret is communicable only to someone who is already having the experience of it." The whole of Aeon is a kind of circumambulation of the secret. Thank you for circling around this secret with me.